PNC, America's Black News Channel. Watch us on all major cable providers and major streaming platforms. Finally, news that speaks to us.
True. I want to bring in Nayyera Haq, our chief foreign affairs correspondent, and of course, our very own Del Walters for added insight here. And I guess, Del, you first. How much of an impact do you believe hearing directly, addressing Congress and watching that video, how much of an effect will it have on lawmakers?
I think that they will rush to the purse strings to try and support Ukraine. But I also heard something, an underpinning of the speech, I think, that might make some lawmakers a little uncomfortable, which is that he pointed out that it's not just Ukraine. And we are going to be pointing out in our broadcast that there are 23 conflicts taking place across the world right now. And those conflicts, too, need the help of the United States, that if you are the leader of the world, you also have to be the leader of the peace. And I took note where he quoted the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. I, too, have a dream.
Yep.
To quote an African-American leader at a time of crisis in Europe really does speak volumes about how far we have come as a nation and as a world. And you wonder now, we were talking about in the commercial break going into this speech, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, the Lauren Boeberts of the world, the Josh Hawleys of the world, who choose to divide us. What will they say about a speech that chooses to unite us to fight a global evil that is threatening Ukraine, and Ukraine saying it's not just us?
Yeah, Nayyera, he's touching at the heartstrings in a lot of ways. He brought up 9/11. He also brought up COVID and the world's fight against that. He's also asking once again for the United States to implement this no-fly zone. Why is that? Tell us, just break it down for the people that don't know. Why is that so difficult for us to do?
The traditional definition of a no-fly zone requires that no other entity be allowed to fly in that area. And in fact, the country or NATO allies that declare the no-fly zone would have to protect it. So that would essentially say that U.S. military forces would be in direct engagement with Russian forces, shooting them out of the sky. Now, I will note that the formulation that Zelenskyy was using was close the skies. He then also mentioned other ways. He said, if this is too much to ask, here's what else you can do for us. Give us the systems. And those are the systems, more surface-to-air missiles. The United States has done some of that. There are more complex systems that we can provide. And where there's additional military support we can provide. That is the likely next step. What was interesting, though, that he laid this at the feet of the United States, tugging on the heartstrings of issues and themes that have driven American identity, right? The I Have a Dream speech, 9/11, being leaders of the world and leaders of peace. But he did not ask and has not gone directly to the United Nations on this. So clearly understanding the dynamics here, Canada, the United States, these individual world leaders asking for their support, the United Nations could send in blue helmets to protect the humanitarian corridor. So there are other things that can be done on the world stage, but Zelenskyy choosing right now to place responsibility at Biden's feet.
Yeah, he wants America to lead. I want you both to tackle this one, and Del, you first. Leading with this fear, I mean, we're all watching the horror, just the horror. We're watching it around the globe. Everyone is. But is leading with that fear enough? Because among the things that President Zelenskyy is saying is Ukraine is the firewall for the rest of Europe. What's next? Is that fear enough to perhaps sway the United States, Canada, to leading and pushing the allies in a more powerful position?
Let me speak to it from the standpoint of the Black News Channel. Why it is important for us to engage in this dialogue and engage now. Should we reach the brink of the unthinkable, where we do find ourselves at war with Russia and then, yes, China entering the fray as well, in Iran and also North Korea, we would be looking at a global world war. Bombs do not discriminate any more than COVID discriminates. And we learned that the hard way. So African Americans have to now start asking the questions, is it the time now to be the leader of the peace? Because if not, when there is a draft that would be reinstituted, should there be a third world war, guess who will get drafted first? Guess who will be the first to die in battle? We have been there before. We have been here before. And I think that's the way we have to frame this, is that, yes, it is Ukraine today, but what happens if after tomorrow? What happens if it is not stopped at Ukraine and NATO does have to enter the conflict and it does, become a global world war, World War III? What happens to Black Americans? What happens to all of the things that we want to happen positively in this country, because we then have to divert the dollars that would go to child care and preschool and all of the things that we want to do because we have to fight a war? So now is the time for us to have the discussions so that we as a nation can decide what we want to do, not only as Black Americans, but as Americans.
And Sharon, what we're seeing here is the needle that the Biden administration is threading. Is their argument is not, yes, they are saying this is about democracy, but they're not arguing to rescue all democracies on the world. They are arguing to stop Russian aggression, specifically with the goal in mind of making sure that World War III does not break out. If this was exclusively about saving the people of Ukraine, you would see a different set of actions, right? This is a very strategic, practical approach, arming the people of Ukraine to defend themselves, making sure that U.S. and NATO allies are not direct targets. That's the red line. Even with Russia sending missiles close to the Polish border, that is the red line for U.S. intervention. Now, the hard part, and this is why Zelenskyy is here, is that he wants more. He does not want to see his country torn apart and trampled because of Putin's power. But at the end of the day, the United States has said its goal is to prevent World War III. The Ukrainians may end up suffering along the way to meet that objective.
I want to go back to Dell's point, because you bring up something crucial in our community when it comes to Black Americans here. Obviously, Zelenskyy is trying to sell the United States on helping them over there. How does Biden sell Black Americans once again on helping the Ukrainians when we need so much help over here, when there are so many aids, when we can't get proper child care? There are so many things that we're clamoring for, that we've been asking for, that there doesn't seem to be enough money, or there isn't a will to give that money to Black Americans. Yet you want us, once again, as Black Americans, if there is another world war, to fight in a war overseas helping somebody else, and then have to come back to this country as it was in Vietnam and still have to deal with the issues that we've had to deal with. So how can, if at all, Biden convince Black Americans that we should care about what's happening over there, which we do have humanitarian, we're human, and we do have empathy, obviously, but at the same time, we still have our issues that we have to deal with as well.
I don't think that Biden is the enemy in this fight. I mean, if you think about it, Biden was one of the first world leaders to say, with regards to COVID, that we have to export more. We have to do more with regards to the vaccines. And even now he's fighting Congress to get the additional money needed, not just to get the vaccines overseas, but the things that are needed to put the shots in arms. I think that what we have to do is convince the rest of a recalcitrant Congress to do more, to really convince Black and brown America that we are still part of America in this debate. We can't look at it as if we are now a divided nation. If we are going to enter this battle, if we are going to fight on behalf of Ukraine, if we're going to do the things that Volodymyr Zelenskyy wants us to do, we have to be the United States of America. We can't be North and South Dakota and Iowa and all of the other places. We have to be one big country. And right now we're not. So I think that the most important thing that can happen is for Congress to unite itself versus the Biden administration being the one that actually is trying to, for instance, integrate the Supreme Court and do the things it is doing. I think it's up to Congress now to act like it's part of the United States of America.
Should Black people care more when, I'm reading these articles and they point to Russia's disinformation campaign. So much of it was aimed at African Americans. And I think these authors are writing these things to engage more. And I understand your point, Del, that we're all Americans, if only others would perhaps see us that more. But what about these seemingly mini campaigns that want to drive Black support of perhaps a greater effort?
That has been a long-standing Russian tactic. It's Sharon, it's something that that Soviet Union used to do even during the Cold War. They would actually talk and bring Black American leaders to Russia and say, look, we're treating you better here than you get treated in your own country. Fast forward to 2016 with the election, knowing the divisions that exist in the United States, they used technology to exploit that, creating fake identities, fake narratives that showed that Black Lives Matter was extra militant, was abusive, right? Furthering the existing racial divides we have in our country. So we can expect that to continue in the course of the war, that Russian propaganda would specifically target Black and brown people to divide against the idea of democracy. Now, I will say this, though. At the end of the day, 40% of the U.S. military is people of color. That is not in the officer ranks, the folks that get to sit in the Pentagon and make the decisions from overseas. That 40% is largely the frontline individuals, right? The infantry, the Marines, they're the ones who will be facing the Russian bullets, who will be standing up to defend essentially white Europeans, the same European Union that turned away Sudanese refugees, Syrian refugees, and is now welcoming Ukrainian refugees. So it is an opportunity to leverage that power and make sure that what support is given with the consent and the approval of the communities here in the United States.
You know, Sharon, when we aired the response to the State of the Union address, I was impressed with something that the Congressional Black Caucus did. The first thing that they mentioned in their response was that the Congressional Black Caucus stands with the people of Ukraine. And I agree 100% with what Nayyera is saying. The easiest way to divide America is along lines of race. We cannot allow that to happen. And it's like I said, bombs do not discriminate any more than a virus discriminates. This will affect us whether we choose to want it to affect us or not. The main thing that we can do is to be the disinfectant that informs the Black populace as to why this is important to us, because sooner or later it is going to happen to us as well.
So then do we need to see more of our... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mike. My apologies.
No, I mean, but you can understand where a lot of people in the Black community will be like, oh, now we're part of the United States of America because you actually need us to be a part of the United States of America. Look, all right, we understand that. We see what's going on. And I understand your point there. Now that Zelenskyy is asked for more help, Congress is giving him a standing ovation. It seems like they're united. What are they going to do about it?
No, that is his job, right? Zelensky's job is to gather the world community and do whatever he can to save his people. Biden and Congress's job is to do what is necessary for the American public. Those two things may not align. Zelenskyy would be thrilled if the United States stepped into this war directly right now to shoot down Russian airplanes. Right? That is a nuclear power that we would be engaging at that point. That is not something we have done in any other situation of any of the crises in the world, including Syria, including Rwanda, where 1 million people were killed in 3 months, right? So there's a sense of let's be consistent in who we are as a country and what we use military power for. With that said, President Biden is going to announce $800 million additional military aid. That is nearly $1.5 billion already supported in military aid. There is so much the United States is doing in this fight that it has not done anywhere else for any other struggling democracy. So that's something that Biden should take credit for, even if it's not everything Zelenskyy wants us to do.
Mike, I was going to point out that perhaps Zelenskyy would have been better if he would have reminded Congress of what it looked like when black leaders in America protested Shell in the Gold Cougar ran, and we saw the release of Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years at Robben Island. He should have reminded America of what it looks like when it leads. And I think that would have sounded better for black Americans, because then we could have seen the contrast in black and white. And we should also remember that the largest crowds that welcomed Barack Obama after he became the president of the United States were in Germany. And those weren't just black faces, those were white faces, and those were European faces. So I think that Zelenskyy might have missed a moment because, quite simply, he probably is not surrounded by a lot of black folk. But I think that's a way that Biden can remind the rest of this nation that we are stronger when we are not divided. Not necessarily that we're perfect, because we're not, but because Russia will want to divide us, and that will be the way that they win. And the only way to stop that from happening is to address the issues overseas and the issues here at home.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we do know there are black-born Ukrainians, and I wonder, Del, maybe you can make this point after the break, if black lawmakers can fill in the gaps where you see President Zelenskyy perhaps missed an opportunity. Much more when we come back.